Well, the other thing is the potential for this thing to widen and ultimately draw us in, thanks to this administration, is enormous.
Yeah.
And if we're drawn into this conflict in any way, whether it is just on the high end conventional side or, God forbid, worse and escalates to the nuclear level, it will be devastating for us. And Americans need to understand that this will be unlike anything they've experienced because, frankly, those other wars that you mentioned were in the realm of colonial conflicts, what we normally refer to as low intensity conflict. It's not the best label because if you're being shot at, there's nothing low intensity about it. But nevertheless, it's a huge difference. And the tens of thousands of casualties, tens of thousands of dead should frighten Americans. And right now, they're not paying that much attention, and they could easily be drawn into this by the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, so for the war in the East itself, what could you compare it to in recent history? Maybe the Iran-Iraq War, something like that?
Well, if you imagine, if you go back to Vietnam, we lost 58,000 men killed over the space of nearly 10 years. And within the last 12 months, we now estimate that close to 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. And there are 300,000 to 400,000 Ukrainian casualties. And more than half of those casualties involve injuries that are so severe these men will never return to duty. And then you have to look at the Russian side. We estimate now 70,000 to 80,000 casualties and 20,000 to 25,000 dead. Now, the reason they're so disproportionate is that 75% of the losses on the Ukrainian side involve losses to artillery, missiles, rockets, drones, in other words, standoff attack weapons. And the Russians outnumber those weapons that the Ukrainians have by 10 to 1. So tens of thousands of artillery rounds are falling on human beings virtually every day across eastern Ukraine. And it's no wonder that the southern Ukrainian defense is crumbling and their casualties are mounting. And they have no way to stay there with any certainty and survive. So I think you're going to see a massive exodus north and west out of the Donbass, which of course is what the Russians want. But until Zelensky gives the order, thousands more will die needlessly in places like Bakhmut or Kupiansk or any number of different places.
Mm-hmm. All right, now then again, they do have the home field advantage. They've got American weapons, and we're a year into this war, and they have held the Russians at not just the Donbass, but the eastern part of the Donbass. The lines obviously are, somewhat fluid, but the Russians aren't occupying too much more territory than the pro-Russian rebels were before the war broke out at this point, right? Well, other than, I guess I should say, the land bridge in the south to Crimea, of course.
Well, the Russians occupy 22 to 23% of the country. They're sitting on top of all the nation's industry and, frankly, 90+% of its gross domestic product. In other words, everything that produces income for Ukraine that's of any real significance is currently under Russian control. That's not really surprising because most of the people that lived there to begin with are Russians, and historically it was Russian, and that really is the only area that Putin was really interested in liberating from Ukrainian occupation and oppression. But I think we need to understand something, that when the Russians went in to begin with, they went in with a relatively small force on the assumption that demonstrating the seriousness with which they took what happened in Ukraine, their legitimate security interests, that we would respond with negotiations. And it took a few months for the Russians to finally discover, well, the Americans are not only disinterested in negotiating, the Americans see this as an opportunity to fatally harm Russia. So the Russians went back, re-examined their options, and decided that they had to go to war. And it's taken them several months to prepare for what you call total war. I wouldn't go that far. I would just say high-end conventional war. And now they have hundreds of thousands of troops in Belarus, in Western Russia, and in southern Ukraine. And I think they're ready for it. The problem is that the winter was short. They only had about 2 or 3 weeks of frozen ground, which would have facilitated some maneuver, but it wasn't enough time in the estimation of the Russian high command to support major offensives that they want to succeed. And so they held back. And what we see now is the mud season. We have vehicles, I get video all the time from all sides showing me trucks and armored fighting vehicles mired in 6-7 feet of mud that they can't get out of. So for the moment, at any rate, the Ukrainians are being helped by the fact that there's no mobility. And the Russians can pursue them to a limited extent, but not to the extent they could if it were dry. Now, this mud is going to dry out, but it will probably take most of March and April for that to happen, which means we won't see the massive movement of forces until May and June. When that occurs, I think they'll rapidly sweep over eastern Ukraine, and I suspect they will then probably cross the Dnieper and start moving west, because one of their goals is to cut off the Polish border from Kiev and cut off Ukraine and its army from any further assistance from us.
Now, how difficult is it from here to keep track of how many brigades and divisions and this and that are left on, in these or those positions on this and that side?
Well, on the Ukrainian side, right now in eastern Ukraine, we estimate there are 16 brigades. Most of those are at 60 or 50 or 40% strength. And if you do the math and you start out with 4,000 in a brigade and you cut that manpower in half, you have an appreciation for the losses, which have been horrific. And they're starting to feed new recruits into the system. I sent you earlier a lengthy comment from people on the ground in Ukraine who are watching the Ukrainians bring in these new recruits. And these are overwhelmingly boys, 15, 16, some even younger, some women, and large numbers of older men in their 50s and 60s. And these people have almost no training, perhaps 2, 3, 4 weeks of familiarity with weapons and so forth, and they're being hurled into the breach. Now, Ukraine still has a few so-called elite formations left that they've been holding in reserve, and I'm told now they're starting to funnel them as a last-ditch effort into what remains of Bakhmut. But the bottom line is the Ukrainians are now scraping the bottom of the barrel for people. In addition to those, you've got about 35,000, maybe a little bit more, Ukrainian soldiers, officers training in Western countries that will eventually come back. They're supposed to have the training that's necessary to operate the more sophisticated equipment, because right now, anything like rocket artillery and your various radars, some of the logistics and the distribution system, the higher staffs, those are populated by NATO military manpower. And without that NATO military manpower, American, German, whatever, in Ukrainian uniform or simply unidentifiable uniforms, I think the whole effort would fall apart. So it's a tragic situation. Ukraine cannot win. It has no chance of winning. And you would think under the circumstances, someone with a degree of some humanity would intervene and say, enough is enough. The Ukrainians have done more than anyone could reasonably expect, and it's time for this to end. But no one in Washington wants to admit that they were wrong.
Well, Doug, the New York Times says that they want to give the Ukrainians long-range enough rockets and permission to use them to hit Russian targets on Crimea in order to let the Russians know that their rear is not safe and we can reach out and touch them whenever we want, and that will put the Ukrainians, I'm defining we broadly to include the American Empire and Ukraine together here, and us
Right.
little old Texans dragged along with them, that the Ukrainians then will be in such a position of strength that then they'll be able to negotiate well with Russia.
Well, that's delusional. We started out by saying that they had thousands of Javelin missiles, and this was a game changer and would turn defeat into victory. The Russians figured out how to counter those and captured large numbers of them. Now, I could go down the list of all the various weapon systems that have shown up that have not been a game changer. Historically, we know that no one silver bullet weapon system dramatically changes the battlefield. It never does. It's always how you integrate it within a broader framework. And right now, the key thing that we're pushing, as you know, are F-16s. And we're currently training 2 Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s. My concern is it will become increasingly obvious if we provide this that the pilots will have to be, once again, contractors, NATO military manpower in contractor garb to fly them. And then secondly, I would expect them to be shot down by the very thick and effective Russian air defenses. The Russian air and missile defenses are quite good. They've managed to massively reduce the numbers of rockets and missiles that get through, and they've effectively erased the Ukrainian Air Force, what there is of it, from the sky, because if they fly, they die. I think that will happen to us as well. So I hope we don't do that. But if we do, and we have even modest success, it's like everything else. No one can protect anything perfectly. So if there's any penetration at all, the Russians may conclude that they might as well go ahead and attack our rear areas. And that means Poland and probably Lithuania, at least insofar as it includes, facilities that are stockpiling weapons and equipment and training Ukrainian forces. But again, the Russians thus far have exhibited tremendous restraint, principally because they don't want a war with Europe, they don't want a war with us. And I'm not sure they need to do that to win. But we ought to understand that, if you do certain things and you think you can do it with impunity, you're nearly always wrong. There are other ways for your opponent to respond. And things are not good in NATO. NATO is deeply divided behind the scenes. People are very unhappy with what's happened. Many people think they've been betrayed by us because we've led them down this garden path. We promised them Ukrainian victory, and they know that's never going to happen, and they now have in front of them something they haven't seen for 30 years, which is an enormous and powerful Russian army and air force, because Putin and his friends have built, in a very short period of time, this enormous force, which they plan to increase to 1.5 million. Right now, it's over 800,000, and focused on Ukraine, 600 to 700,000. So I think the Europeans want to put an end to this. They just haven't figured out how to do it without upsetting their relationship with us.